Imagine standing at dawn's first light, when the world feels cleansed and limitless. Islam views every soul exactly like that sunrise, untouched, unburdened, brimming with potential. There is no shadow of ancestral fault dimming your horizon, no inherited stain chaining you to yesterday's mistakes. Instead, you awaken on a pristine canvas where every choice you make can paint hope, purpose, and redemption. This conviction that each person begins life pure and empowered lies at the heart of why Islam rejects the notion of original sin. It invites you to step forward with confidence, to own your story, and to meet God not as a debtor seeking to erase an ancient deficit, but as a purposeful traveler eager to shape a radiant destiny through conscious faith and compassionate action. In Islam, the arrival of a newborn is celebrated not only for the gift of life, but also for the profound reminder it offers about human nature itself. Each infant, the tradition teaches, emerges in a state called fitrah, a pristine moral and spiritual blueprint untouched by guilt or blemish. This concept reframes the very starting point of existence. Rather than entering a world as carriers of an inherited wrong, we step onto life's stage endowed with an innate capacity for truth, compassion, and conscious choice. The implications of this belief are both liberating and uplifting. It means that the very first breath a child draws is not weighed down by a debt accrued before consciousness, but is instead a testament to untarnished possibility. Parents hold not a soul in need of purification from ancestral missteps, but a trust to be nurtured, a being whose natural inclination is to recognize goodness and respond to it. This view aligns seamlessly with observable childhood traits. Curiosity, empathy, and wonder appear long before explicit moral instruction. Islam interprets these early glimpses of virtue as echoes of fitra, evidence that purity is humanity's default rather than a distant ideal. Of course, environment, choices, and influences later shape the trajectory of this innate disposition, but the starting point remains one of innocence and promise. The idea counters narratives in which humanity's first act is framed as failure. Instead, it elevates the earliest chapter of life to a space where divine generosity and human potential meet. On a practical level, the doctrine influences Islamic ritual and community practice. The adhan, softly recited into a newborn's ear, is not an exorcism of inherited sin, but a gentle welcome into conscious awareness, planting seeds of remembrance and gratitude. Circumstances that befall children, illness, hardship, or even death, are never interpreted as punishments for pre-existing guilt. They are seen through the lens of life's tests and mysteries, not as echoes of a primordial offense. This ethos extends further. When adults look at one another, they are urged to recall that same original purity, countering cynicism with empathy and trust in each person's capacity for transformation. Ultimately, Islam's assertion that every soul begins unblemished affirms the worth of every individual and underscores a worldview in which hope is native and redemption is a personal journey, not ancestral restitution. Islam grounds its understanding of justice in the principle that every individual is accountable solely for their own deeds, neither inheriting the sins of predecessors nor transferring guilt to descendants. The Quranic maxim, "No bearer of burdens shall bear the burden of another," encapsulates this ethos, dismantling any notion of collective transgression passed down through bloodlines. In practical terms, this means that moral responsibility begins when a person acquires awareness and the capacity to choose. It does not start with events that occurred long before one's birth. Such personal accountability fosters a relationship with God that is direct and undiluted. When someone errs, the path to restoration is straightforward. Recognize the wrongdoing, feel genuine remorse, correct the behavior, and seek divine forgiveness. There is no inherited debt to repay, no vicarious atonement required. The ledger opens anew with each human life, and entries are made only by that individual's choices. This framework nurtures a healthy sense of agency. People are neither crushed by ancestral mistakes nor lulled into complacency by ancestral virtue. Instead, they are reminded daily that their destiny is carved by their own intentions and actions. Socially, this doctrine encourages fairness and discourages prejudice. If guilt cannot be transmitted across generations, discrimination based on lineage loses moral legitimacy. Each person stands before society and before God on the merit of his or her character and conduct. Communities are thus urged to evaluate individuals by present behavior, not historical grievances or inherited statuses. This has ripple effects in law and culture. Children are not punished or stigmatized for crimes their parents committed. Conversely, noble ancestry offers no exemption from accountability. Psychologically, the emphasis on individual responsibility cultivates hope. A person mired in personal failure is not also burdened by the weight of humanity's primeval missteps. The horizon of redemption remains uncluttered. Likewise, someone striving for virtue cannot outsource that effort. There is constant motivation to act consciously and consistently. This paradigm also frames suffering through a distinct lens. Trials a person faces are not divine penalties for ancestral faults, but opportunities for growth, patience, and spiritual refinement specific to that individual's journey. Ultimately, by rejecting inherited guilt, Islam upholds a vision of divine justice that is both uncompromising and compassionate. Uncompromising because each choice matters eternally. Compassionate because no one begins life shackled to a sin they did not commit. In Islam, the bond between a human being and God is envisioned as immediate, uncluttered, and continually accessible, making the concept of inherited sin and the elaborate rites devised to erase it unnecessary. When a person falters, the tradition prescribes a process called tawbah, or turning back, rooted in 3 inward steps and 1 outward: conscious recognition of the wrongdoing, sincere remorse for having violated one's moral compass, a firm resolve not to repeat the act, and where possible, repair of any harm caused. These steps occur in the privacy of the heart before they are expressed in conduct. No priestly class is needed to authenticate the plea, no ritual sacrifice to appease divine wrath, and certainly no inherited stain to be ceremonially washed away. The Quran depicts God as closer than your jugular vein, a metaphor that highlights immediacy rather than distance. Because of this nearness, the moment a person's conscience awakens to a mistake, the path of return is already open. This renders the spiritual life dynamic and personal. Every heartbeat can host a prayer, every regret can bloom into moral renewal, and forgiveness is a living, experiential reality rather than a theological abstraction mediated through lineage. The absence of original sin amplifies this intimacy. No primordial barrier clouds the conversation. When one stands to pray, one does so as a responsible individual, accountable for present choices but unencumbered by ancestral debt. Practically, this doctrine encourages continuous self-reflection. Instead of postponing reconciliation until a sacramental event, Muslims are taught to engage in regular istighfar, seeking forgiveness throughout the day. A whispered plea while commuting, a tearful midnight supplication, or a small act of restitution toward a wronged neighbor all count as valid avenues to divine grace. This fosters an environment where moral course correction is swift, humility is habitual, and spiritual growth is self-driven. Community life benefits as well. Because forgiveness is not monopolized by an institution, no human authority gains ultimate control over another's salvation. Religious leadership in Islam is therefore advisory rather than sacerdotal. Scholars guide, but they do not absolve. This decentralization guards against spiritual elitism and keeps moral responsibility squarely in each believer's hands. It also builds resilience. A lapse does not exile someone from communal worship until a formal rite is performed. One can rise from error, turn the heart toward God, and re-enter the communal rhythm almost instantly. Ultimately, the direct relationship model reflects a divine economy of mercy tailored to individual agency. While mistakes are inevitable, redemption is always one sincere breath away, underscoring that life's moral narrative is authored in real time by each person in dialogue with a compassionate and ever-listening creator. Islamic theology places divine mercy at the very heart of the universe, portraying it not as a limited concession but as the prevailing current beneath all existence. A well-known prophetic saying declares that God has written mercy for himself, signaling that compassion is the Creator's chosen posture toward creation. This emphasis reframes the human story. Mistakes are real and accountability is firm, yet the atmosphere in which those mistakes occur is suffused with readiness to forgive. In practice, this means that no sin, however grave, is locked beyond the possibility of pardon as long as a person seeks reconciliation sincerely. The Quran even describes God as the most merciful of those who show mercy, implying that every expression of kindness we witness in the world is but a faint echo of an infinitely greater source. Such a worldview naturally diminishes the need for a doctrine like original sin. If mercy is the default, then humanity does not require an extraordinary theological mechanism to escape inherited guilt. There is simply no inherited guilt to escape. Instead, life becomes a series of opportunities to rediscover divine compassion through conscious return. The daily prayers themselves embody this rhythm. Each cycle begins with the phrase, "In the name of God, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful," imprinting the twin attributes of compassion on the believer's mind dozens of times a day. This liturgical constant shapes expectations. One approaches God anticipating generosity, not condemnation. Psychologically, the primacy of mercy instills hope. A believer confronting personal failure does not spiral into despair over a cosmic stain dating back to the dawn of humanity. Instead, the heart can say, "I slipped, but the door of forgiveness is wider than my error." That confidence fuels resilience, encouraging moral growth rather than paralyzing shame. It also fosters empathy toward others, recognizing that everyone lives beneath the same ambience of mercy. A person becomes more inclined to extend forgiveness horizontally within society. Ethically, divine mercy balances divine justice. Accountability remains essential, actions do carry consequences, but mercy ensures that those consequences serve rehabilitation rather than annihilation. Even prescribed penalties in Islamic law are tempered by avenues for reprieve, emphasizing repentance and societal restoration over raw retribution. Ultimately, the conviction that mercy outweighs wrath paints a cosmos where hope eclipses fear, where every dawn offers a renewed chance to draw closer to the compassionate one, unburdened by ancestral debt and propelled by the assurance that forgiveness is always within reach. Islam portrays human nature as fundamentally sound, a vessel crafted with the inherent capacity to recognize truth and incline toward goodness. This optimistic anthropology begins with the fitra, the innate moral intuition with which every person is born. Rather than depicting humanity as irreparably damaged by a primeval fall, Islam envisions individuals as travelers equipped from birth with an internal compass that points toward integrity, empathy, and awareness of the divine. That compass can become magnetized by environment, dulled by neglect, or skewed by ego, yet it never disappears entirely. Its subtle pull can be felt whenever conscience stirs at the sight of injustice or the memory of a compassionate act. Because this baseline orientation is presumed healthy, moral growth is framed not as the struggle to escape a corrupt essence, but as the effort to uncover and polish what is already there. This positive view reshapes the journey of life into a process of refinement rather than repair. The Quran frequently calls people to remember God and their own origins, suggesting that deep within, the soul already knows the path of virtue. Ethical exhortations are thus presented as reminders, not impositions. Echoes meant to awaken dormant awareness. When a person acts generously, the tradition affirms they are not transcending a depraved nature, but revealing its true form. Consequently, lapses into wrongdoing are treated as deviations that need realignment, not confirmations of an inherited flaw. This distinction carries profound psychological weight. Guilt can motivate correction, yet it never hardens into self-loathing over an immutable defect. Hope remains the dominant emotional climate because change is always attainable. One is working with intrinsic potential, not against an internal enemy. In community life, the presumption of basic goodness encourages trust and cooperation. Social systems are designed under the expectation that people can act responsibly when given guidance and opportunity. For example, Islamic jurisprudence values testimony, contracts, and mutual counsel, mechanisms that function only if honesty and reliability are considered accessible to ordinary people, not rare exceptions. Education, then, focuses on nurturing latent virtues through knowledge, discipline, and spiritual practice, rather than administering a cure for congenital corruption. Spiritually, the optimistic anthropology fosters gratitude. To wake each morning believing one's core is designed for serenity and benevolence cultivates a deep appreciation for the Creator's artistry. Failures become lessons, successes become confirmations of grace, and the overarching narrative is one of ascent toward a destiny aligned with the soul's original purity. In this light, the rejection of original sin is not merely a theological disagreement. It is an affirmation that the human story starts with promise, unfolds through conscious choice, and can culminate in the full flowering of the goodness seated within from the very first breath. Across the landscape of Islamic history, prophets stand as vivid demonstrations of personal responsibility, each embodying the message that individual effort, not inherited conditions, secures a person standing with God. Their stories converge on a single thread. They exemplify the very obedience they ask of others, proving that moral accountability is practicable and immediate. Take Noah, who persisted in preaching righteousness for centuries, facing ridicule yet never blaming ancestral faults for his community's resistance. Or Abraham, who dismantled his society's idols, accepting the risk of fire rather than attributing collective error to some primordial slip. Moses confronts tyrannical power with resolve born of personal conviction, and Muhammad, called the trustworthy, even by opponents, lives so transparently that his honesty becomes the bedrock of his mission. None appeal to a mythic depravity to explain human failings. Instead, they urge contemporaries to assess their own choices and realign them with divine guidance. This narrative architecture shapes Muslim consciousness. When believers read of Adam's lapse in Eden, the Quran promptly depicts him seeking forgiveness and receiving it, illustrating that repentance is personal and effectual. Adam's children are not portrayed as doomed by his mistake. Rather, they inherit a template for how to recover from theirs. Likewise, when Jonah abandons his post and is swallowed by the great fish, his solitary prayer of remorse leads to rescue, carving into collective memory the lesson that even prophets must account for their actions. These episodes underscore Islam's core claim: salvation hinges on the interplay between divine mercy and individual response, not on bloodline or collective right. In daily practice, this model inspires self-scrutiny. During the 5 daily prayers, each worshiper recites verses pledging allegiance to God alone and asking for guidance, an acknowledgement that no prophetic lineage or communal identity can substitute for personal fidelity. The annual pilgrimage to Mecca reenacts Abraham's surrender and Hagar's perseverance, inviting millions to step physically into the prophet's footprints, thereby internalizing their accountability. Even communal rituals such as Friday prayer begin with a sermon that almost invariably calls believers to fear God and speak words directed to the truth, a reminder that every listener is individually addressed. The prophetic pattern also democratizes moral authority. If every prophet exemplifies taking ownership of destiny, no follower can claim exemption. Leaders, scholars, and lay people alike are measured by the same yardstick: integrity in belief and action. Thus, rejecting original sin is not merely doctrinal. It springs naturally from a tradition in which revered figures model that each soul negotiates its own covenant with the Creator, proving through lived example that righteousness is achievable one decision at a time. And this continuity between prophet and follower builds a spiritual culture rooted not in fatalism, but in agency. It tells every soul, you are not born broken, you are born capable. You are not carrying the weight of ancient failure, you are carrying the potential to rise. The stories of the prophets are not myths of unreachable perfection. They are mirrors, showing us that struggle, repentance, and growth are part of every sincere journey. This understanding ignites a powerful sense of purpose. If prophets stood firm against the tide of corruption in their time, then we too can stand with integrity in ours. If they turned to God after mistakes and found forgiveness, then no believer is ever too far gone. And if they bore personal responsibility for their mission, so must we take responsibility for our choices, without blaming our nature or our past. Ultimately, the Islamic rejection of original sin affirms that divine wisdom entrusted each soul with its own light. We are not born condemned, we are born called to know, to grow, and to return. And in the footsteps of those who came before us, we walk forward not burdened by their sins, but inspired by their courage.